Hello and welcome back to another episode of Underscored, a podcast brought to you by Young Voices. I am your host, Stephen Kent, spokesperson and public relations manager for Young Voices, and today we've got a conversation about the question of capital punishment, the death penalty, and how it is being handled in state legislatures across the country. We're going to be joined by Young Voices writer and contributor, Patrick Hauf, who recently wrote over at glennbeck.com that the death penalty is in decline in America, that more states are coming out against it and moving to minimize the role that the state has to play in, executing its own people. So we're going to find out a little bit more about that right now with Patrick Hauf.
He writes, capital punishment is on its last breath in the U.S. Interestingly enough, it's the GOP that may deliver the final blow. In 6 different states this year, Republican lawmakers have introduced bills to repeal the death penalty. This is good news. Patrick, welcome onto the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, happy to talk to you. So tell us a little bit about what is going on. You mentioned that there's a movement going on against the death penalty in states across the country. What are those states, and why are we not really hearing about this? Because this definitely feels like a low-key trend if there is one.
Yeah, the death penalty hasn't been receiving that much media coverage, at least in terms of national media. But for the most part, it's a local state issue. And this year, there's been 6 states, Wyoming, Kentucky, Montana, Missouri, New Hampshire, and Washington, where Republican lawmakers have introduced bills to repeal the death penalty, which sort of contradicts the narrative that Republicans favor the death penalty, which is also supported by 77% of Republican voters. So you sort of see a contradiction here between Republican voters and Republican lawmakers.
So why is that divide taking place? Because I tend to think of the GOP as being quite responsive to its base and following the whims of its base. And I also do correctly, in that sense, think of GOP voters and primary voters as being quite animated about maintaining the death penalty and in some cases intensifying the death penalty. So why are their lawmakers going in the other direction?
Yeah, I think at the national level, especially, the GOP is thought of as the party of law and order, especially in the Trump era, per se. But when we're talking about the death penalty, we're talking about mostly a state issue, and state politics are, a whole different animal, really. And a lot of Republican lawmakers feel the death penalty doesn't fit conservative values because of the inefficiency of the government's enactment of the program all across the country.
What do you mean when you say inefficiency? Are we talking about failure to kill people properly? Are we talking about botched executions? Or are we talking about the financial aspects of the death penalty? Because I have heard and seen that it is relatively expensive as opposed to lifetime incarceration.
Oh, yes. There's plenty of different aspects of the death penalty that sort of support the narrative that it is an inefficient government tool that conservatives should be against. And in Texas, which is a huge proponent of the death penalty, a death penalty case costs about $2.3 million, which is 3 times the cost of one prisoner's 40-year sentence in a single cell with maximum security. So, it's not even close how much more expensive the death penalty is in Texas. And that's a nationwide trend. That's just one specific example. Then you also have the way the death penalty is enacted. We know of 160 individuals in the U.S. since 1970 who were sentenced to death, but later exonerated. So, and there was another 15 where there's a lot of evidence pointing to their innocence, and they were actually executed. So the death penalty is, if you look at it in one way, it's the government's greatest tool. It's a control over life and death. And Republican lawmakers are starting to become skeptical of that powerful tool.
So where do you sort of fall on this? Are you more of the view that it is a wild expense to carry out executions and capital punishment this way, or do you fall more on the matter of principle? Because a critic of your viewpoint might just say, well, I don't want there to be an expensive method of execution and handling the death penalty, with all these lethal injections and sort of, the amount of time that someone will spend on death row. I'd rather just have them put in front of a firing squad. So what would you say to that? And where do you sort of fall on this issue in terms of your motivations?
Yeah, well, a lot of where most of the cost is the court costs. And the thing about America is it was founded on justice, and we're always going to have that justice. And when there's a growing, opposition to the death penalty, these cases are going to be expensive. And that's just sort of what the political reality is. And sure, we can have debates over how we can make the death penalty less expensive. And those are debates I'm willing to have. But overall, the reality is the death penalty is extremely expensive and extremely inefficient.
Do you think that there's any sort of risk for Republican lawmakers in states like Wyoming, Kentucky, Montana, in walking back the death penalty with their voters? I mean, is there some sort of electoral angle here that they're considering, or are they just sort of hoping that it flies under the radar?
I mean, there's always going to be a risk when you're contradicting 77% of your own party, but I think it's a risk that Republican lawmakers have been willing to take, considering they know the death penalty doesn't receive much coverage. And like I said, state politics are just a whole different breed of politics. You really got to watch your local news station to be paying attention to these things. And another point I make in my article is that a growing opposition to the death penalty within the Republican Party could actually grow their base. When you look at the three groups Republicans struggle with, women, African Americans, and young people, they have a higher opposition to the death penalty than the national average. So if Republicans really can rally around opposing the death penalty, maybe people who are more skeptical of the GOP start to think, hey, maybe my views align more with them than I really thought.
We hear a lot about that angle, I think, from reform conservatives, criminal justice reformers, folks working on things like occupational licensing, kind of the ilk of like the R Street Institute, that it's a huge electoral benefit and opportunity to sort of work on some of these justice reform issues and bring in sympathetic voters. But Pat, I don't feel like that ever happens. Do you really feel like criminal justice reform has expanded the GOP's base or just given them good public relations opportunities?
But we'll have to see. It's a big if. We're not 100% sure. I mean, the GOP at the national level just passed the First Step Act in December. So we're only a couple months into that. And I'm sure Republicans are disappointed in the amount of coverage the First Step Act received nationally. And I really do believe many people within the mainstream media who lean left are a little worried, thinking, hey, this criminal justice reform was supposed to be our issue. Why are the Republicans taking it? And that's why I don't think you're seeing these issues get much coverage at the national level. So if Republicans keep continuing to push this criminal justice narrative, whether it's in terms of the death penalty or just prison reform in general, the media is going to have to cover it eventually. And I think that really will expand the base.
Tell me about some of the groups and organizations that are working on this issue, because I imagine that this is the sort of issue that sort of comes out of the think tank world and then gets sort of put in front of lawmakers. Where are people sort of getting these ideas from in legislatures, and how are they approaching the dismantling of the death penalty? What does that look like in practice in, say, any of these states, Wyoming, Kentucky, New Hampshire, whatever?
One specific organization I've been paying a lot of attention to isn't the typical more so libertarian-minded criminal justice reform organization. There's a group called the Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. That's newer and still a little smaller, but they do a lot of great work in studying on just how many Republican lawmakers are pushing for death penalty repeals, and also explaining why Republicans should be pushing for those repeals. So I think you're starting to see criminal justice expand from a libertarian issue to a Republican issue.
Well, Patrick Hauf, what does it look like in practice when a death penalty is rolled back in a state? What are the alternatives? What does it look like in the justice system when you're not doling out capital punishment? Because I think people, and I think I kind of come from this myself a little bit in my upbringing, we're just sort of raised to believe, that there are certain tiers of crimes, and at a certain point, a certain kind of crime is so egregious. A triple homicide and child rape along the way is just going to equal you getting the electric chair or the death penalty by lethal injection. That just sort of was baked into, I think, a lot of people's consciousness in terms of what justice is and the lines between different sorts of crimes. So how do you make the case to people who really believe that, there is a certain sanctity of life that, you violated and you've sort of broken the social contract in such a way that you have given up your right to be part of society? How do you bring people along with you who are not on that side where they are currently?
That's a great question, and that's definitely how a lot of the Republican base feels, especially the older Republican base that I talked about before. And I really sort of try to avoid these philosophical or even theological discussions in my article in Glenn Beck. But one thing I will say is a lot of proponents of the death penalty cite that it deters crime. But a lot of studies have been contradicting that claim, and we're not really 100% sure whether or not the death penalty does deter crime. Because, life without parole is in itself terrifying. In fact, some people would even prefer to die rather than just sit in jail for the rest of their life. And when I talk about life without parole, I'm talking about those brutal criminals. You're talking about, child rapists and murderers. So
that is true. I've heard instances, particularly in Nevada, of people sitting on death row who are suing the state because they would like to be executed, and it's taken a long, long time for that to happen. So I guess I still don't feel like my question has been answered, though. I mean, how do you bring people along to try to change the dynamic about capital punishment and convince people that this way is right?
I think you got to bring these studies up. You have to talk to them. Okay, why exactly do you support the death penalty? Is it because you think it deters crime? Okay, well, here's a study that shows that might not be true. And then that can lead into, like I said, a lot of different philosophical, theological debates, whether whether those beliefs that we're talking about from the Republican base is in their religion. Then you can start to debate those ideas. And you can also look at the way the Catholic Church and even some Protestant churches are walking away from their pro-death penalty stances. And that, again, leads to a whole other debate, but that's definitely worth having, and definitely has an influence over the way the Republican Party will legislate.
What went on with the Catholic Church changing their position? I wasn't aware that they were ever in favor of the death penalty.
Yes, well, they weren't necessarily in favor of the death penalty. They were fairly neutral on the topic until over the summer, Pope Francis changed the language in the catechism to say the death penalty is never acceptable. Pope John Paul II, who is now a saint, and Pope Benedict, the past two popes before Pope Francis, they sort of were rolling back on the death penalty, but they didn't completely they didn't go to the grounds that Pope Francis did in saying that the death penalty is never acceptable. So that was a big change in the Catholic Church, and it did outrage some Catholics and some evangelicals, but it does show the broader trend of a growing opposition to the death penalty.
Well, I do find it pretty compelling when you say that since 1970, 160 people have been put to death wrongfully who were exonerated of those given crimes. I mean, if you sort of believe that, I don't know, a certain level of crime is worthy of you having your life taken away from the state and your membership in a society being revoked in that absolute way, I guess you have to ask, well, is 160 people who were innocent murdered by the state worth you maintaining that point of view? That's a pretty high cost to pay, and you'd have to really, you'd have to make quite an effort to look away from that when faced with that number, because 160 people is no small drop. And, I'm with you when you say that, the death penalty isn't going to deter crime. I don't think someone like Ted Bundy was thinking about what his punishment was going to be when he committed those kinds of acts. There are certain types of people engaged in criminality who are just risk averse. They don't think in that way, and I think it sort of is foolish to assume that all people sort of think with that sort of calculus in mind.
Couldn't agree more.
Patrick Hauf, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me about this, and thank you for sharing your piece with us.
Thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun.
All right, and that brings us to a close for another episode of Underscored. I've been your host, Stephen Kent. You can follow me on Twitter at Stephen_Kent89. That's Stephen with a PH _Kent89. You can find Young Voices on Twitter at YVADV. We look very much forward to hearing from you. And please do follow our guest today, Patrick Hauf, at Patrick Hauf on Twitter. Lots of action going on there, new work from him on a wide range of issues, whether that be Bernie Sanders, socialism, conservatism in the U.S., and the death penalty. Definitely worth throwing him a follow at Patrick Hauf. We'll be back later this week with more from Underscored. Until then, stay free.